Today's project is replacing the rear main seal in my 1976 Corvette small block 350. It's been leaking generally, for the most part, out of this drain hole in the flywheel cover. So far I have gotten the motor warm, drained all the oil, let it sit for a few hours. I went ahead and we'll go ahead and replace the oil filter. I'm going to leave it off for the time being just to leave more room to work. The first step will be taking off this idler arm. There are two 19/16 bolts up here and here. That will let the idler arm drop the steering assembly here so that we can slide out the oil pan. So I've loosened the idler arm bolts, taken them out. It's much easier to access the top bolt through the top versus the bottom. But you'll notice now that it allows this whole steering assembly to drop down and give quite a bit of clearance there to get the oil pan out. So the next phase will be taking off the flywheel cover. There are a couple of 1/2-inch bolts back here that hold on the automatic transmission activator, and there are, I believe, 4, I think there's 7/16 bolts that hold this flywheel cover on. So that will all come off so we can access the back end of the oil pan bolts to get those out. Okay, the flywheel and torque converter cover is now off. So far so good. One minor correction is the bolts that hold this cover on are 3/8, not 16ths. So next step will be taking off a whole series of bolts around the oil pan, as well as I believe we've got some fuel line brackets over here too that are mounted to that as well. So that will be up next. Okay, the oil pump bolt is out now. It was a 5/8 bolt. It's torqued in, I think, about 65 foot-pounds, so you may want to use a breaker bar if you can't break it loose with your regular wrench. So just a little tap and comes right out. And you can see there the end is got the slot for the drive from the distributor. So next up will be taking out these two 5/8" cap bolts. So the 2 bolts are now out of the cap. I've tapped on it with a rubber mallet. Be sure to not use a hammer. And caps just pop loose. And there we go. And you can see there's the rear main seal right there. So that's what we'll be taking out and exchanging for a new one. So you can see on the old seal here, there's about 3/8 of an inch or so where this seal was joined because it's a 2-piece seal. You can see it rotates around pretty right there. You see where it came apart. That's how the new one will be installed too. You want to offset these so that they don't line up with where the cap seals against the block, because otherwise you may develop a leak there. So we've pulled off half the seal. Now you can see the rest of the seal still is hanging in here. Be sure we don't nick the shaft with our needle nose pliers, but just work this thing around until we get it out. And then we'll be able to clean it up and put a new one in. And there we go. So I mentioned about a little bit of cleanup needing. There's just a little bit of sealant right there, RTV, and on this side as well. And we will put sealant in those places as well on the reassembly, just to kind of help add a little extra oomph in there to our seal. But otherwise, the rest of the oil pan gasket area is very clean, and that's because they used a Felpro 1-piece gasket, which is what we will use as well to put back in. It just makes for super easy cleanup on the oil pan and the block surface. It saves a lot of time. So now we're getting ready to put everything back together. We got the cap all cleaned up. We can see that we've got the half of the gasket in place. Notice the big lip on here is what needs to face the front of the engine. That's, I guess, to help hold all that oil in. Everything's cleaned up. We also coated the inside of the bearing race with Permatex Ultra Slick, and we'll put that on the bottom side of the crank as well too, to lubricate it. We're also going to put just a little tiny bit of RTV on each edge here of the cap, and then just a little smidge on the ends of the gasket itself, just so that it joins together. Note that it's offset 3/8 of an inch from the edge, so the edges don't line up with the cap edges, to help keep the oil in place. The bolts for these two for the cap are ready to go. They've got oil on the threads, motor oil. Here's the bolt for the oil pump. There is the oil pump, cleaned up. Check the screen, it's in good shape. The previous owner had replaced it with not too many miles on it as well. I got the Felpro kit BS40013, which also includes a new nylon sleeve. This extension just pops off, and the old one pops off, and you snap it back together. Also make note when you take this out to check your alignment for your drive here, to make sure that you keep track of where that is, at least approximately. It's pretty easy to line back up, but it's going to go back up into the bottom of the distributor, which is what's going to drive this thing. So, and we'll get back under there and start wrenching it back together. Okay, so now we've put our Ultra Slick on the bottom side of the crank, bottom side of the bearing, also coated some through the groove of the new seal. And we took this piece of plastic that has a little knob on it that Felpro supplies. You stick that over the little edge that feeds in this groove to keep it from acting as a knife and peeling your seal apart. So we've got that in place. Now we just work the seal around, and we'll get it to a point of having about 3/8 of an inch sticking out on the other side, and then we'll go back in and clean it up a little bit and get some RTV on the end of it, and then we'll mount the cap back up there. The 2 bolts for the cap will be torqued at 65 foot-pounds. We'll do those in increments of 20, 20, and then 25 to finish it off. So here we go. So now we've got our seal in place. We've got a little bit of RTV dabbed on each end of the seal, as well down here and on the edges of the cap. We're going to put the cap up to it, use a rubber mallet to tap it into place. One thing to remember is when you do push this seal around, don't use anything that could potentially score your crankshaft. I just used a small piece of wood with a piece of cardboard to finish getting it out, but also make sure you have the big lip of the seal facing forward towards the front of the engine. Make sure both pieces line up, that you've got the seal approximate place that's going to just marry straight up to the crank. Okay, so now we've got our oil pump. You'll see we've got the drive shoved up in this hole here. Hopefully we've got it pretty close to where distributor alignment is. Basically, you take it up to that, give it a little wiggle. It should seat totally flat if it's lined up. If it's not, pull it back out. You can easily twist that shaft to make it go up. So now we're going to put our bolt in and torque it to 65 pounds. So now it's time to do the oil pan gasket and oil pan installation. Using this Felpro kit OS 34510T, which is a one-piece gasket, which I'm a big fan of. That was what was on the car before. Makes for cleanup super easy. You don't use any adhesive, at least for the most part. We'll use a little bit of RTV just in a few of the corners, just to kind of help seal. Also comes with this snap-ups deal, which is for the larger bolts on the 4 corners, just kind of hold the gasket in place. and you can do a much easier pan installation as a result. Keep everything straight. Comes with a complete set of bolts and lock washers. Got the pan all cleaned up. It looks really good. So easy to clean up after that. The filters on it before. One other thing I put in here, is kind of as a side note, is a magnetic drain plug, and that's kind of handy just to see if you get anything metallic in your oil. It'll stick to it at least, and hopefully keep from sucking it up and throwing it through your engine and ruining it. Also got the flywheel cover all cleaned up. Used brake clean on that, which is what I've also used to clean other gasket surfaces, and it does a nice job. So anyway, on to the oil pan gasket and oil pan. Okay, on to the next step. But before we get to that, I did want to talk about oil pumps just real quick. If this pump hadn't already been so new, I would have went ahead and replaced it. They're relatively inexpensive. Highly recommend replacing an old oil pump if you've got one. Also, as far as priming the pump too, when we go to start it, after it's done here, what I'll do is I'll disconnect the distributor cap and just crank the engine and watch my oil pressure gauge until I'm sure we've got pressure going in there before I make the engine hot to start it. So anyway, we've put the snap-ups in place for the gasket, and also put in just a little bit of RTV right in these corners on each side, in the front and the rear of the engine. Just, I guess those are the most common leak points for these oil pan gaskets of this type, and this is just a little preventative measure. So next we'll snap up the gasket. The gasket's now in place past the pop-ups, which help hold it up in place nicely. I also recommend shoving your dipstick up and out of the way while you're getting this in place. Just one less thing to hassle. In fact, you might be better off just taking it out before you start doing this whole project. So all we'll do at this point then is we'll push the oil pan up into place and then start putting in the small bolts on the sides. We will join you later. Okay, the oil pan is now propped up by the snap-ups here, so we'll just go ahead and start putting these little bolts in finger tight. The oil pan is now mounted and torqued in. The small bolts up here are torqued in at 8 foot-pounds, which my torque wrench reads inch-pounds, so it's 96 inch-pounds. The corner bolts around the corner there, those are in at 18 foot-pounds. Just a little hint here for the 7/16 bolts up in beside the starter here, which are kind of hard to reach. I've got a magnetic plug deal that I stuck in my 7/16 socket because I don't have any super shallow sockets, even though this one is still about the small size they typically make, but that makes getting those bolts in much easier because the bolts are kind of short and they won't reach the threads real well when they fall down into your socket. So that's one tip I recommend. Another one is this fuel line bracket here. I would say install that one last, because then you can move the fuel lines around a little bit to get to the other bolts further up the line there. So anyway, the only thing remaining to do at this point would be to install my oil filter, put the flywheel cover on, which there's 4 bolts that hold that dude in. Put the transmission linkage back up in there too. Get the idler arm mounted back up in his spot up in there. Just a couple bolts for that. And oil it up and prime it, and then and start it. And hope your installation goes well. Good luck. Thanks for watching.